The smell of smoke woke Silas Turner before the sun did, and by the time he crested the ridge above Cedar Falls, Colorado, he could see the black plume rising from the small clapboard bakery at the edge of town like a warning flag against the pale October sky of 1878. He had come down from the mountains only to trade a season's worth of pelts for salt, coffee, and a new axe head, not to play the hero for a burning building. But as he rode closer, leading his pack mule down the rutted road, he realized the smoke was not the roaring black of a structure fully aflame. It was thinner, angrier, coughing out of a stovepipe in fits and starts, and there was a woman standing in the doorway of the bakery, waving a dish towel at the haze filling her own kitchen, cursing under her breath in a way that made him almost smile despite the early hour. Silas Turner was a big man, the kind that made doorways look smaller when he passed through them, with shoulders built from years of hauling traps and felling timber, and forearms corded with muscle beneath the rolled sleeves of his buckskin shirt. His dark hair hung past his collar, unruly and sun-streaked, and a short beard shadowed a jaw that had not seen a barber's blade in longer than he cared to admit. He looked like a man who belonged to the wilderness, not to a town with painted signs and picket fences, and yet here he was, drawn by smoke and the sound of a woman's frustrated voice carrying on the cool morning air. He swung down from his horse near the hitching post outside the bakery and looped the reins loosely, watching as the woman disappeared back inside, only to emerge again dragging a tray of what looked like a dozen small blackened loaves, each one charred nearly to coal on the bottom. "Ma'am," he called out, not wanting to startle her, though the crack of his deep voice through the smoky air did exactly that. She spun toward him, tray still in her hands, cheeks flushed from heat and effort, a few strands of chestnut hair escaping her braid and sticking to her damp forehead. "I do not have time for solicitations this morning, mister, whatever you are selling," she said, setting the tray down hard on the wooden bench outside her shop, where a small hand-painted sign read Maddox Bakery in fading blue letters. "As you can see, I have troubles enough." "I am not selling anything," Silas said, holding up his hands, palms out, the universal gesture of a man meaning no harm. "Name is Silas Turner. I was riding in for supplies and saw your smoke. Thought maybe you needed a hand before your whole building went up." She looked at him properly for the first time then, her hazel eyes narrowing slightly as they took in his size, his rough clothes, the knife at his belt and the rifle strapped to his saddle. Most women in town would have stepped back at the sight of him, mistaking his size for danger, but she only crossed her arms and let out a short, humorless laugh. "The building is not going to go up, Mr. Turner. It is just my oven, being contrary as always. Third batch this week ruined. I have got the morning rush coming in less than an hour, and all I have to offer them is charcoal masquerading as bread." She gestured at the tray with an exhausted flick of her wrist. "If you know how to fix a stubborn old brick oven, then by all means be my guest. If not, I would be obliged if you would let a woman suffer her failures in peace." Silas almost laughed at the fire in her, a woman clearly worn thin by hardship but not broken by it, still sharp enough to spar with a stranger twice her size. "I have fixed worse than an oven," he said. "Spent years building cabins and hearths up in the high country. Mind if I take a look?" She studied him a moment longer, weighing something private behind her eyes, and then stepped aside from the doorway, the towel still clutched in her hand like a small flag of surrender. "Fine, but if you break it worse than it already is, Mr. Turner, I will have the sheriff run you clean out of Cedar Falls." "Fair enough," he said, and ducked his head to step through her doorway, the top of his hat nearly brushing the frame. Inside, the bakery was small but clean, lined with shelves that should have held golden loaves and pastries, but instead sat mostly empty save for a basket of the morning's failures. The big iron and brick oven sat against the back wall, its door hanging slightly crooked, smoke still curling from around its edges despite the fire inside having mostly burned down. Silas crouched before it, running a broad, calloused hand along the seams of brick, feeling for the draft that should not have been there. "Your damper is warped," he said after a moment, glancing back at her over his shoulder. "See here, where the metal has bent from the heat. It is not sealing right, so your fire runs too hot in spurts, then chokes itself when the draft closes wrong. That is why everything comes out burnt on the bottom and raw in the middle." She had moved to stand near him, arms still crossed, though some of the hardness had left her expression, replaced by something more like reluctant curiosity. "My husband installed that oven himself 3 years back before he passed. I have not had the money to have it looked at proper, and the blacksmith in town charges more than I make in a week of good baking." "I am not asking for money," Silas said simply, standing up and brushing soot from his palms onto his trousers. "I have got tools on my mule outside, and it will not take more than an hour to straighten that damper and reset the seal, if you have got clay or mortar on hand." She hesitated, and he could see the pride warring with practicality in the tight line of her mouth. Finally, she nodded. "There is a tub of clay out back near the wash basin. I use it for patching the chimney sometimes." She paused. "I am Georgia Maddox, by the way. Seeing as you already know my bakery's business and half of my morning troubles, it seemed only proper you know my name too." "Georgia," Silas repeated, testing the shape of it in his mouth, finding he liked the sound of it more than he expected to. "Well, Georgia Maddox, let us see if we cannot get this oven fixed before your rush arrives." He worked quickly and with a quiet confidence that came from years of solving problems with his hands out of necessity rather than instruction, and Georgia found herself watching him more than she meant to as he pried the damper loose, hammered it flat against a stone with the back of his hatchet, and reseated it with careful, precise motions. His hands, so large they looked as though they belonged to a man who could crush stone, moved with surprising gentleness as he packed fresh clay along the seams, smoothing it with his thumb the way a man might smooth frosting on a cake, though she doubted he had ever done such a delicate thing in his life. "You are handy for a mountain man," she said, unable to help the small note of teasing in her voice, though she immediately wondered if she had overstepped. Silas glanced at her, a slow smile finally breaking through his beard, softening the hard lines of his face into something almost boyish despite his obvious years of hard living. "A man who lives alone in the high country learns to fix what breaks, or he freezes come winter. There is no blacksmith up there to run to when your only stove cracks in a snowstorm." "That sounds a lonesome way to live," Georgia said before she could stop herself, and then flushed, embarrassed at how easily the words had slipped free around this stranger. "It has its quiet moments," Silas admitted, turning back to his work. "But quiet is not always the same as lonesome. Sometimes it is just quiet." He paused, testing the damper's new give with 2 fingers. "This ought to hold you now. Try relighting it, careful and slow, and see how she draws." Georgia fetched kindling and a few precious matches, and together they crouched before the oven as she coaxed a small flame to life, feeding it gently until it caught and steadied. She adjusted the newly repaired damper, watching with growing hope as the smoke that had been billowing into the kitchen instead began drawing properly up the chimney, the fire settling into a steady, even burn rather than the violent flare it had before. "Well, I will be," she murmured, a smile breaking across her face for the first time that morning, transforming her from a woman worn down by hardship into someone younger, brighter, the kind of woman who might have laughed easily once, before whatever grief had settled into the lines around her eyes. "Mr. Turner, I believe you have just saved my morning rush." "Just Silas is fine," he said, straightening up to his full height, which put him a full head and shoulders above her. "And I am glad to have been of use. Would hate to think of good bread going to waste on account of a stubborn piece of iron." Georgia moved to the counter where her mixing bowls sat waiting, flour already measured, and began working with quick, practiced hands, kneading dough that would, she hoped, actually rise and bake properly this time instead of joining its ruined siblings in the scrap basket destined for the hogs. Silas found himself lingering, telling himself it was only to make sure the oven held steady through a full baking cycle, though some quieter part of him knew it was also simply pleasant to watch her work, to be in the warm, yeasty-smelling kitchen instead of alone on the trail with only his mule for company. "How long have you been running this bakery alone?" he asked, leaning against the door frame, arms crossed over his broad chest. Georgia's hands stilled for just a moment on the dough before resuming their rhythm. "Going on 8 months now. My husband, Thomas, he died of a fever last winter. Left me this bakery and not much else besides debts I am still working to pay down." She glanced up at him, gauging his reaction, perhaps expecting pity or discomfort at the mention of her widowhood, but Silas's expression remained steady, open. "I am sorry for your loss," he said simply, without the awkward platitudes so many offered, and something in his plain sincerity eased a tightness in her chest that she had not realized she was carrying. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It has been hard, harder than I let most folks see. This bakery is all I have got now, and some mornings it feels like even that is fighting me." "Well," Silas said, glancing toward the oven, now humming along steadily, "seems this morning it is on your side at least. Let us see what kind of bread it gives you." They fell into an easy silence as Georgia shaped the dough into loaves and slid them onto the oven's stone shelf, and Silas found himself telling her, unprompted, about his years in the mountains west of Cedar Falls, about trapping beaver and marten, about the winter he had nearly lost 3 fingers to frostbite before an old trapper named Ezra Coyle had taught him how to properly wrap his hands against the cold. Georgia listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she was actually curious rather than merely polite, and Silas realized with some surprise that he had not spoken this many words to another living soul in months. The bell above the bakery's front door jingled, announcing the arrival of the first customer of the morning rush, a stout woman in a faded green bonnet who Georgia introduced as Mrs. Prout, the Reverend's wife. Mrs. Prout's eyes went wide at the sight of Silas filling the small kitchen doorway, and she offered Georgia a look that carried a question neither of them addressed aloud. "Good morning, Mrs. Prout," Georgia said smoothly, ignoring the look. "Bread will be ready shortly, I promise you. My oven was giving me trouble, but it has been fixed up proper now." "Well, that is a relief," Mrs. Prout said, though her eyes kept darting to Silas with obvious curiosity. The whole street was talking about the smoke earlier, thought perhaps the bakery had finally given up the ghost. "Not today," Georgia said, and there was a note of pride in her voice now, a steadiness that had not been there an hour before. "Today it is going to give us the finest bread Cedar Falls has seen all week." True to her word, when the timer she kept by watching the fire's glow told her the bread was ready, she pulled the loaves from the oven with a long wooden peel, and they emerged golden brown, crusty on the outside, the smell of properly baked bread filling the small shop and drifting out into the street beyond. Mrs. Prout's eyebrows rose in genuine appreciation, and soon more customers were filing in, drawn by the smell that had been notably absent from the bakery for the better part of a week. Silas stood back near the doorway, watching Georgia work the counter, wrapping loaves in paper, making change, exchanging pleasantries with townsfolk who clearly knew and cared for her despite whatever hardships had marked her recent months. There was a rhythm to her movements now, a confidence that had bloomed the moment her oven began cooperating, and Silas felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth in his chest at having been the cause of it, however small his part had truly been. When the initial rush finally slowed, Georgia turned to find him still there, and a faint blush colored her cheeks as though she had forgotten, for a moment, that he had been watching the whole exchange. "You are still here," she said, sounding almost surprised. "Wanted to make sure the oven held," Silas said, which was true enough, though it was not the whole truth. "Looks like it is behaving itself." "Thanks to you," Georgia said. She wiped her hands on her apron and reached beneath the counter, producing one of the finished loaves, still warm, and held it out to him. "Please, it is the least I can offer for what you have done this morning. I could not have paid the blacksmith for a proper fix, not for weeks yet, and here you have done it for nothing." Silas took the loaf, feeling its warmth seep into his palms, and something about the simple gesture, the bread offered freely by a woman who had precious little to spare, struck him harder than he expected. "This is more than enough, Georgia, thank you. Will you be in town long?" she asked, and there was something in the question that suggested she hoped the answer might be yes, though she seemed almost surprised at her own curiosity. "I have got supplies to gather," Silas said. "General store the blacksmith for that axe head, maybe stop by the trading post before I head back up. Could be a day, could be two, depending on what needs doing." "Well," Georgia said, glancing toward her nearly empty bread shelves, already thinking ahead to tomorrow's baking, "if you find yourself with an evening free, the bakery closes at 6. I sometimes make a proper supper afterward, more than I can eat alone. It would not be much trouble to set another place at the table, as thanks for what you have done today." Silas felt something shift in his chest at the invitation, a warmth that had nothing to do with the bread still warm in his hands. "I would like that," he said. "I would like that very much." Georgia smiled, and this time it reached all the way to her eyes, chasing away the last shadows of the difficult morning. "Then I will see you this evening, Silas Turner." He touched the brim of his hat, an old habit from a life mostly spent alone, and stepped back out into the bright October morning, his mule waiting patiently at the hitching post, the loaf of bread cradled carefully against his chest, as though it were something far more precious than mere flour and water and yeast. The rest of his day passed in the ordinary business of a mountain man, restocking for the coming winter. He traded his pelts at the general store for salt, coffee, ammunition, and a length of good rope, haggling with the shopkeeper, a thin, sharp-eyed man named Otis Reed, over the price of a new axe head until they settled on terms that satisfied them both. At the blacksmith's, he had his horse reshod and picked up a few iron fittings he would need for repairs to his cabin before the snows came in earnest. All the while, though, his thoughts kept drifting back to the small bakery, and the woman with hazel eyes and flour-dusted hands who had looked at him, not with fear or suspicion, but with genuine warmth. Cedar Falls was not a large town, having grown up around a silver strike some 15 years prior that had since played out, leaving behind a modest but stable community of ranchers, merchants, and the families who served them. The main street held perhaps a dozen businesses, a small church with a white steeple, and a scattering of houses spreading out toward the surrounding hills where cattle grazed on land not yet claimed by the encroaching fences of homesteaders. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where a stranger's arrival did not go unnoticed, and Silas was aware of the curious glances that followed him as he moved about his errands, aware, too, of the whispers that likely centered on his morning visit to the widow Maddox's bakery. He did not much care what the townsfolk thought. He had spent enough years away from society to have grown comfortable in his own skin, indifferent to gossip that could not touch the solitary life he had built for himself in the mountains. But he found himself hoping, as the afternoon wore toward evening, that Georgia herself was not troubled by whatever talk his presence might have stirred. At 6:30, with the sun beginning its slow descent behind the western peaks, Silas found himself once more standing before the bakery, now dark and quiet, its front door locked against the evening. He knocked at the side door that led to what he assumed was Georgia's living quarters above the shop, and after a moment, he heard footsteps, and the door opened to reveal Georgia, her hair now loose from its earlier braid, falling in soft waves around her shoulders, wearing a simple blue dress that was clearly her evening attire rather than her working clothes. "You came," she said, and there was a note of relief in her voice that suggested she had half expected him not to. "I said I would," Silas replied, feeling suddenly and uncharacteristically nervous, a sensation he had not experienced in longer than he could easily remember. She led him up a narrow staircase to a small but comfortable set of rooms above the bakery, the smell of a simmering stew filling the space, mixing pleasantly with the lingering scent of that day's baking that seemed to have permanently infused itself into the very walls. A small table had been set for two, with mismatched but carefully polished silverware and a single candle providing warm, flickering light against the gathering dusk outside the window. "It is not much," Georgia said, gesturing at the modest spread as she ladled stew into two bowls. "But it is warm and there is plenty of it." "It smells wonderful," Silas said honestly, settling his large frame into a chair that seemed almost comically small beneath him. "I have been living on trail rations, and whatever I can shoot for longer than I care to admit. This is a rare treat." They ate in comfortable conversation, Georgia asking more about his life in the mountains, curious about the cabin he had built with his own hands some 5 years back, nestled in a high valley 2 days' ride from Cedar Falls. He told her about the creek that ran near his property, thick with trout in the summer months, about the herd of elk that passed through the valley each fall on their way to lower ground, about the long winters when snow could pile chest-deep against his door, and the only company he had was his own thoughts, and the occasional visit from Ezra Coyle, the old trapper who had taught him most of what he knew about mountain living. "Do you ever get lonely up there?" Georgia asked, echoing the question she had almost asked that morning but had held back. Silas considered the question seriously, turning his spoon slowly in his bowl. "I used to tell myself I did not, that a man alone was a man free of complications, free of the kind of hurt that comes from caring too much about another person. But," he paused, glancing up to meet her eyes across the small table, "sitting here now, in a warm room with good food and better company, I find myself wondering if I was not just telling myself a comfortable lie all this time." Georgia's breath caught slightly at the honesty in his words, and she found herself unable to look away from his steady gaze. "I know something of comfortable lies," she said quietly. "After Thomas died, I told myself I was fine on my own, that the bakery was enough, that I did not need anything more than the routine of flour and fire and customers to fill my days. But some nights, this apartment feels awfully big for just one person." The candle between them flickered, and for a long moment neither spoke. The silence filled instead with the quiet acknowledgement of two people who had each convinced themselves that solitude was a choice, rather than merely the shape their grief and circumstance had carved for them. "Tell me about Thomas," Silas said gently, sensing that she needed to speak of him, that grief unaddressed had a way of festering rather than healing. "If you would like to, that is. I do not mean to pry." Georgia was quiet for a moment, twisting her spoon absently in her stew. "He was a good man," she said finally. "Kind, steady, not much given to grand gestures but always reliable. We married young back in Missouri and came west together with dreams of building something of our own. This bakery was his idea, really, though I did most of the actual baking. He handled the books, dealt with suppliers, that sort of thing." She smiled faintly, a bittersweet expression. "He got sick during a hard winter 2 years back, a fever that would not break no matter what the doctor tried. I nursed him for 3 weeks before he passed. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, watching him fade like that, knowing there was nothing I could do to stop it." Silas reached across the small table, an instinctive gesture, and covered her hand with his own, his large palm swallowing her smaller one entirely. "That sounds like a terrible grief to carry," he said. "I am sorry you had to face it." Georgia did not pull her hand away. Instead, she turned it slightly beneath his, so their fingers intertwined, a small gesture that felt somehow enormous in the quiet of the room. "Thank you," she said softly, "for listening. Most folks in town mean well, but they get uncomfortable when I speak too plainly about him, as though grief were something to be hidden away rather than simply lived through." "I do not scare easy," Silas said, a small smile touching his lips. "Not from grief, not from grief bears, not from much of anything, if I am honest. Comes from spending too much time alone with my own thoughts, I suppose. A man learns to sit with hard things rather than run from them." They finished their meal slowly, reluctant to let the evening end, and eventually moved to sit near the small window overlooking the darkened main street of Cedar Falls, watching as lamplight flickered on in windows up and down the road, the town settling into its evening quiet. Silas told her more of his history, of growing up in Tennessee before the war had scattered his family, of coming west afterward with nothing but a rifle and a determination to build a life away from the ruins the conflict had left behind. He did not dwell long on the war itself, and Georgia sensed there were depths of pain there he was not yet ready to share, and she did not press him. "What made you decide to become a mountain man then?" she asked instead. Rather than settling in a town, taking up a trade, Silas considered the question. "I tried town living for a spell after the war, worked as a blacksmith's apprentice in Kansas for near 2 years, but I never could shake the feeling of being closed in, hemmed by walls and fences and other people's expectations. First time I rode up into real mountain country, saw those peaks stretching out further than a man could see in any direction, I knew that was where I belonged. Something about the size of it all makes a man's troubles feel smaller, somehow more bearable." "That sounds beautiful," Georgia said, a wistful note in her voice. "I have lived in towns my whole life, Missouri then here. I have never seen real mountains up close, not the kind you are describing." "Cedar Falls sits right at the edge of them," Silas pointed out. "You could see them easy enough if you had a mind to." "Perhaps someday," Georgia said, though there was something in her tone that suggested she did not truly believe the opportunity would ever arise, that her responsibilities to the bakery kept her too tethered to town to indulge in such fancies. The evening wore on until Silas finally rose reluctantly, aware that propriety demanded he not overstay his welcome at a widow's home, however innocent their conversation had remained. "I should let you rest," he said. "You have got another early morning ahead of you." "Thanks to you, it should go smoother than this one did," Georgia said, walking him to the door. "Will I see you again before you head back up the mountain?" "I would like that," Silas said, echoing her words from that morning. "If you would not mind the company." "I would not mind it at all," Georgia said, and there was warmth in her voice that made his chest tighten pleasantly. "The bakery opens at 6. If you happen to be an early riser." "I am always up before the sun," Silas said with a small smile. "Comes from years of tending traps before dawn." "Then I will see you tomorrow, Silas Turner," Georgia said, and for a moment, standing there in the doorway with the candlelight behind her, casting her in warm golden light, Silas felt an urge he had not felt in years, an urge to lean down and press his lips to hers, to see if she tasted as sweet as the bread she baked. He resisted it, mindful of the newness of their acquaintance, mindful too of the grief she still carried, but he allowed himself to hope that such a moment might come, in time, if he was patient and careful with whatever was beginning to grow between them. "Good night, Georgia," he said instead, and stepped out into the cool October darkness, his heart lighter than it had been in longer than he could remember. The next morning, true to his word, Silas arrived at the bakery before dawn broke fully over the eastern hills, finding Georgia already at work, the newly repaired oven humming steadily as she prepared the day's first batch. She greeted him with a smile that seemed to come more easily than it had the previous day, and he spent the morning helping where he could, hauling water, splitting kindling for the fire, even trying his hand at kneading dough under her patient instruction, his large hands proving surprisingly capable at the task once he found the proper rhythm. "You have got a gift for this," Georgia observed, watching him work the dough on the flour-dusted counter, his forearms flexing with each careful fold and press. "Most men I know would rather muck out a barn than get their hands into bread dough. Kneading dough is not so different from working a piece of leather or shaping a horseshoe," Silas said. "It is all about knowing how much pressure to use, when to be firm, and when to be gentle. I reckon a man who spends his life working with his hands learns that lesson eventually, whatever trade he takes up." Georgia found herself watching his hands more than she probably should have, noting the contrast between their obvious strength and the careful gentleness with which he handled the delicate dough. There was something deeply appealing about a man so powerfully built who nonetheless took such care with small, fragile things, and she felt a warmth kindling in her chest that had nothing to do with the heat of the oven. Over the following days, a pattern established itself between them. Silas would arrive early before the morning rush and help however he could around the bakery, his presence quickly becoming familiar to the regular customers who had initially eyed him with suspicion, but who now greeted him with easy nods and occasional bits of friendly conversation. In the evenings, he would return for supper, and they would talk long into the night about everything and nothing, sharing pieces of their pasts, their hopes, their small daily observations about the world around them. He told her more about his cabin in the mountains, about the garden he kept there in the short summer growing season, about the small herd of goats he had acquired from a passing settler 2 years back that provided him with milk and cheese through the winter months. She told him about her own childhood in Missouri, about learning to bake at her mother's side, about the dreams she and Thomas had shared of building something lasting together, dreams that his death had left half-finished, but that she was determined to see through, if only for the sake of honoring his memory. On the fourth evening, as they sat together on the small bench outside the bakery, watching the last light fade from the sky, Georgia turned to him with a question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. "Silas, how long do you intend to stay in Cedar Falls? I know you came for supplies, and those errands cannot take much longer to complete." Silas was quiet for a long moment, watching the first stars emerge in the darkening sky above the mountains he called home. "Truth is, Georgia, I have already gathered everything I came for, have had it packed and ready since 2 days past." "Then why have you stayed?" she asked, though something in her voice suggested she already suspected the answer, hoped for it even. "Because I find myself reluctant to leave," Silas said, turning to face her fully now, his dark eyes serious in the fading light. "Because these past few days with you have shown me something I did not know I was missing, up there alone in my mountains. I have got no right to ask this of you, not after knowing you so short a time, but I find myself unable to simply ride away without speaking my mind on the matter." Georgia's heart was pounding now, and she found herself holding her breath, waiting for him to continue. "What is it you want to say, Silas?" "I want to say that I have not felt this way about another person in longer than I care to admit, if ever I truly have," Silas said, his voice rough with the effort of the confession. "I want to say that the thought of riding back up that mountain and leaving you behind feels like leaving behind something I did not even know I was searching for. I know it is too soon. I know your grief for Thomas is still fresh, and I do not mean to rush you or presume upon feelings you may not share. But I could not leave without telling you the truth of what has grown in my chest these past few days." Georgia felt tears pricking at her eyes, though they were not tears of sorrow but of something far more complicated, joy and fear and hope all tangled together. "Silas, I have felt something too these past days. Something I thought had died along with Thomas, something I was not certain I would ever feel again. But I am frightened, if I am honest. Frightened of caring for someone again, only to lose them the way I lost him. Frightened of what it might mean to build something with a man who lives so far from town, so far from everything I have built here." "I would not ask you to give up your bakery," Silas said quickly. "I would not ask you to abandon what you have built here, what Thomas helped you build. If anything came of what is growing between us, I would find a way to make it work, whether that meant spending more time in town myself or finding some middle ground between your world and mine." "You would do that?" Georgia asked, surprised. "Give up your solitary life in the mountains after all these years?" Silas considered the question seriously, as he considered most things. "I have loved my mountains, Georgia, loved the peace and freedom they offered me after the war left me feeling like I did not fit anywhere else. But these past days have shown me that peace found alone is a hollow kind of peace, compared to what might be found alongside someone who understands you, who challenges you, who makes ordinary moments feel like something worth treasuring. If choosing you meant adjusting how I live, I would count that a fair trade, and gladly made." Georgia reached out and took his hand, the same gesture from their first supper together, but this time she did not hesitate, did not need his prompting to close the distance between them. "I am not asking you to choose right this moment," she said softly. "I only know that I do not want you to ride away tomorrow and disappear back into those mountains as though these past days meant nothing. I want the chance to see where this might lead, slowly, carefully, in whatever way feels right for us both." "Then I will stay," Silas said simply. "As long as you will have me nearby, I will stay in Cedar Falls, or close enough to it that distance is no obstacle to what we might build together." The relief and joy on Georgia's face was answer enough. And this time, when Silas leaned toward her, closing the distance that had lingered between them since that first morning of smoke and burnt bread, she met him halfway, and their first kiss was soft and searching, tasting faintly of the cinnamon she had used in that evening's baking, sealed beneath a sky just beginning to fill with stars. They pulled apart slowly, both slightly breathless, and Georgia laughed softly, a sound of pure happiness that Silas felt certain he could listen to for the rest of his days. "Well," she said, "I did not expect my burnt bread to lead to this." "Sometimes the best things come from the messiest beginnings," Silas said, echoing sentiments he had learned from years of watching nature's own cycles of destruction and renewal in the mountains he called home. "A forest fire clears the way for new growth. Maybe a burnt batch of bread cleared the way for something neither of us expected to find." Over the following weeks, Silas found lodging at the town's small boarding house, run by a widow named Mrs. Hendricks, who fed her boarders well and asked few questions about their business, and he took up occasional work at the blacksmith's shop and helping local ranchers with fence repairs and other tasks suited to his considerable strength, earning enough to sustain himself while remaining close to Georgia and the bakery. His mornings still began early, helping Georgia prepare for the day's baking, and his evenings were spent in her company, the two of them growing closer with each passing day, their conversations deepening, their comfort with one another expanding into something that felt increasingly permanent and solid. The townsfolk of Cedar Falls, initially curious and occasionally gossipy about the mountain man's sudden and prolonged presence in their midst, gradually warmed to him as they saw the genuine care he showed toward Georgia, and the practical help he offered not just to her, but to others in the community. He fixed Mrs. Pruitt's leaking roof without being asked, helped old man Jenkins repair his wagon wheel after it split on the rocky road leading into town, and generally proved himself to be a man of substance and character, rather than merely a rough wanderer passing through. Reverend Pruitt, whose wife had been among the first to witness Silas's presence in the bakery that fateful morning, took to inviting him to Sunday services, and though Silas had not attended church regularly in years, he found himself accepting the invitation, sitting beside Georgia in the modest pews, feeling a sense of community and belonging that had been absent from his solitary mountain existence. It was nearly a month after their first meeting, as autumn deepened toward winter and the first frosts began appearing on the ground each morning, that trouble arrived in Cedar Falls in the form of a man named Jasper Hale, a cattle buyer who had known Thomas Maddox in his final months, and who had, unbeknownst to Georgia, been quietly harboring intentions of his own toward the young widow, intentions he had been biding his time to act upon. Believing that sufficient months had now passed since her husband's death for such advances to be considered proper, Jasper arrived in town on a crisp November morning, his fine clothes and well-groomed appearance marking him immediately as someone of means, someone quite different from the rough-edged mountain man who had become such a fixture at the bakery in recent weeks. He made his way directly to Maddox Bakery, entering with the confident air of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Georgia Maddox," he said, removing his hat with a flourish as he approached the counter where she was arranging a fresh tray of pastries, It has been too long since I last had the pleasure of your company." Georgia looked up, recognition dawning slowly. "Mr. Hale, I had not expected to see you in Cedar Falls again. I thought your business with Thomas concluded some time ago." "My business with your late husband concluded, yes," Jasper said, his smile carrying an oiliness that made George's skin prickle with unease. "But I find myself with other business in this area now, business that concerns you directly, if you would permit me to speak plainly." "I am quite busy this morning, Mr. Hale," Georgia said, gesturing toward the half-empty shelves that still needed restocking. "Perhaps you could state your business quickly." Jasper's smile did not waver. "I have thought of you often since Thomas's passing, Georgia. A woman of your beauty and industry should not be left to struggle alone with a business better suited to a partnership. I have come to offer you exactly that. Marriage, and with it, the resources to expand this bakery into something far grander than its current modest scope, or indeed, to leave this small town altogether for a life of greater comfort in Denver, where my business interests are primarily concentrated." Georgia stared at him, momentarily too stunned by the boldness of his proposal to formulate a response. "Mr. Hale, I barely know you. We have met perhaps 3 times, always in the company of my husband on business matters. This is hardly appropriate." "Appropriate or not, it is a genuine offer, made with genuine intentions," Jasper pressed on, undeterred by her clear discomfort. "I have made inquiries about your situation, Georgia. I know the bakery struggles financially, know that you carry debts from Thomas's final illness that a marriage such as I propose could resolve entirely. I am not a man given to romantic flights of fancy, but I am a practical man who recognizes value when he sees it, and I see considerable value in what you might offer as a wife, and considerable benefit I might offer you in turn." The transactional coldness of his proposal, framed as though she were a business venture to be acquired rather than a person with feelings and agency of her own, sparked genuine anger in Georgia, cutting through her initial shock. "Mr. Hale, I appreciate that you consider this a generous offer, but I must decline. My feelings are otherwise engaged, and even were they not, I would not marry a man on the basis of practical arrangement alone, however financially advantageous it might appear." Jasper's expression cooled considerably at her refusal, the polished charm slipping to reveal something harder beneath. "Your feelings are engaged, you say? I have heard talk in town of some mountain man who has been lingering here these past weeks. Surely you cannot be seriously considering a future with such a rough, uncultured character over what I am offering." "Silas Turner is a man of considerable character," Georgia said sharply, her earlier discomfort giving way to protective anger on Silas's behalf. "Far more character than a man who arrives uninvited to propose marriage to a widow he barely knows, treating her circumstances as an opportunity to be exploited rather than a life to be respected." "You will regret this decision, Mrs. Maddox," Jasper said, his voice tight with barely concealed anger at her rejection. "This bakery will fail within the year without proper investment, and your mountain man will likely abandon you the moment town life proves too confining for his wild nature. When that happens, do not expect my offer to remain open." He turned and stormed out of the bakery, leaving Georgia shaken but resolute in her decision. She spent the rest of the morning working through the confrontation in her mind, and when Silas arrived that evening for their customary supper, she related the entire exchange to him, watching his expression darken with each detail. "He had no right to speak to you that way," Silas said, his jaw tight with anger, his large hands clenched into fists on the table between them. "Treating you like a piece of property to be acquired rather than a woman with her own mind and heart." "I handled it," Georgia said, reaching out to cover his clenched fist with her hand, feeling the tension in his muscles gradually ease at her touch. "I told him no, told him my feelings were engaged elsewhere. He did not take the rejection well, made some threats about the bakery failing and you abandoning me, but I do not believe a word of it. You should not have to face such treatment alone, Silas said. If he troubles you further, I want you to send for me immediately. I will not have any man speaking to you with such disrespect, treating your grief and your struggles as mere leverage for his own gain. I appreciate that, Georgia said softly, but I am not as fragile as Mr. Hale seems to believe. I have survived worse than an unwanted marriage proposal these past months. I know you are strong, Silas said, his expression softening as he turned his hand beneath hers to interlace their fingers. Strong enough that you do not need my protection, perhaps. But I would offer it regardless, because that is what a man does for the woman he loves, whether she strictly needs it or not. The word love hung in the air between them, spoken for the first time, and Georgia felt her breath catch at the weight of it. You love me? She asked softly, needing to hear it confirmed directly. I do, Silas said, his dark eyes steady and sincere in the candlelight. I have known it for some weeks now, if I am honest, but I did not want to speak the words until I was certain you were ready to hear them, until enough time had passed that you might trust the sincerity of my feelings, rather than mistaking them for mere infatuation born of proximity. I love you too, Silas Turner, Georgia said, tears of happiness gathering in her eyes. I did not think I would ever feel this way again, not after losing Thomas, but you have shown me that the heart is capable of healing, of opening again to new possibilities, even after profound loss. They sealed the confession with a kiss, deeper and more certain than their first tentative 1 week before, and when they finally parted, both were smiling, the earlier tension from Jasper Hale's unwelcome visit forgotten in the warmth of their mutual declaration. But Jasper Hale, proving himself a man unaccustomed to rejection, did not simply disappear from their lives as they might have hoped. Over the following days, whispers began circulating through Cedar Falls, whispers that traced back clearly to conversations Jasper had been having at the town's saloon and general store, suggesting improprieties in Georgia's relationship with Silas, questioning the appropriateness of a widow entertaining a man in her home so soon after her husband's death, even hinting darkly that perhaps Silas's presence in town had less noble motivations than simple courtship, that perhaps he sought to take advantage of a vulnerable widow's assets and business. The gossip reached Georgia through Mrs. Pruitt, who arrived at the bakery one morning with an expression of concerned discomfort, clearly torn between loyalty to Georgia and her own sensitivity to social propriety. Georgia, dear, I do not mean to distress you, but I feel you ought to know what is being said around town. Mr. Hale has been suggesting that your relationship with Mr. Turner is, well, less than proper, and some folks are beginning to wonder if perhaps he has designs on your bakery rather than genuine affection for you. Georgia felt anger flare hot in her chest, but she kept her voice steady as she responded. Mrs. Pruitt, I appreciate your concern, but I can assure you that Mr. Hale's suggestions are motivated entirely by his own wounded pride at my rejection of his marriage proposal, nothing more. Silas Turner has shown me nothing but respect and genuine care since the day we met. I believe you, dear, Mrs. Pruitt said, patting her hand reassuringly. I have seen how he looks at you, how he has helped folks around town without asking anything in return. But you know how gossip travels in a small place like this, and Mr. Hale seems determined to make trouble. The gossip did indeed spread, and Georgia noticed a slight cooling in some of her regular customers' demeanor over the following days, a hesitancy that had not been present before, born of uncertainty about the propriety of her situation. It pained her deeply, not for herself, but for the potential damage to Silas's reputation, a man who had done nothing but offer help and honest affection since his arrival in town. Silas, for his part, remained steady in the face of the gossip, refusing to let it affect his behavior or his commitment to Georgia. Let them talk, he said one evening, when Georgia expressed her frustration and worry over the situation. Talk cannot change what is true between us, and eventually, folks will see for themselves the truth of our intentions, regardless of what poison Jasper Hale tries to spread. But the situation came to a head nearly 2 weeks after Jasper's initial visit, when he returned to Cedar Falls unexpectedly, this time accompanied by two rough-looking men who Georgia did not recognize, men whose presence in town immediately raised concerns among the local sheriff and townsfolk alike. Jasper made his way to the bakery once more, this time waiting until closing time when he could be assured of finding Georgia alone, his two companions lingering conspicuously outside the shop's windows. "Georgia," he said, his tone carrying a false pleasantness that did not reach his cold eyes, "I have come to renew my offer, given time for reflection. Surely you can see now the wisdom in accepting a stable, prosperous future over whatever fantasy you have constructed with your mountain vagrant." "My answer remains the same as before, Mr. Hale," Georgia said, keeping her voice steady despite the unease his companion's presence stirred in her. "I would ask that you leave now and not return again with such proposals." "I am afraid I cannot simply accept that answer," Jasper said, his voice hardening. "You see, Georgia, I hold the note on this building. Thomas took a loan from my associates back in Denver to cover the initial construction costs of this bakery, a loan that has not been fully satisfied. I have recently acquired that debt, and I find myself in a position to call it due immediately, unless you reconsider my offer." Georgia felt the blood drain from her face at this revelation. She had known Thomas had taken some loans to establish the bakery, but she had believed those debts settled, or at least manageable through her ongoing payments to the bank in town. "That cannot be right," she said, though uncertainty crept into her voice. "I have been making payments regularly." "To the local bank, yes, for a portion of the debt," Jasper said, his smile turning triumphant at her evident distress. "But there was a secondary loan, one Thomas took to cover equipment costs, that debt held by my associates. I have purchased that note specifically for this purpose, Georgia. Marry me, and I will forgive the debt entirely, folding this bakery into a larger enterprise under my management. Refuse, and I will call the note due within 30 days, an amount I am quite certain you cannot possibly raise in that time frame, resulting in the loss of this building and everything you have built here." The cruelty of the scheme left Georgia momentarily speechless. The realization that Jasper had deliberately sought out and acquired this leverage specifically to force her hand settling over her like a physical weight. Before she could formulate a response, however, the bakery's side door opened, and Silas stepped through, having arrived for their evening supper only to walk into the middle of this confrontation. He took in the scene quickly, Georgia's distressed expression, Jasper's triumphant posture, and the two rough men visible through the front windows, and his own expression hardened into something dangerous, though his voice remained carefully controlled when he spoke. "Is there a problem here?" "Ah, the mountain man himself," Jasper said, turning to face Silas with barely concealed disdain. "This does not concern you, Turner. This is a matter of business between myself and Mrs. Maddox concerning a debt her late husband incurred that I now hold the rights to collect." "It concerns me plenty, when it involves threatening the woman I love," Silas said, moving to stand beside Georgia protectively, his large frame a solid, reassuring presence at her side. "What debt are you speaking of?" Georgia quickly explained the situation, her voice shaking slightly with the strain of the confrontation, and Silas listened with growing anger, though he kept himself carefully controlled, aware that violence would only worsen the situation and potentially harm Georgia's standing in the community, however satisfying it might feel to simply throw Jasper Hale bodily from the bakery. "This debt," Silas said, once Georgia had finished explaining, "how much are we speaking of exactly, and do you have documentation to prove your claim to it?" Jasper's confidence flickered slightly at the direct challenge. "The note is for $300, and I assure you, my claim is entirely legitimate. I can produce the documentation from my associates in Denver readily enough." "Then produce it," Silas said calmly. "Bring proper documentation to the town bank. Let them verify the legitimacy of your claim, and if it proves accurate, I will personally see to it that the debt is satisfied, in full, without any need for coercion or unwanted marriage proposals directed at Mrs. Maddox. This offer clearly caught Jasper off guard, as he had not anticipated Sela's possessing sufficient resources to simply pay off such a debt outright. You would have $300 readily available, Turner. Rather a substantial sum for a man who lives in the mountains trapping beaver. I have spent little of what I have earned over the years, having few expenses beyond basic supplies, Sela said. Trapping and trading has been good to me over the years, and I have savings set aside that I had intended for purchasing additional land or improving my cabin. I can think of no better use for those savings than protecting Georgia from your predatory scheme. Jasper's expression shifted through several emotions: calculation, frustration, and finally, grudging acceptance that his leverage had been effectively neutralized. "Very well," he said stiffly. "I will bring the documentation to the bank tomorrow morning. If your funds prove sufficient to satisfy the debt, I will consider this matter concluded, and I will trouble Mrs. Maddox no further." "See that you do not," Sela said, his voice carrying a quiet warning that promised consequences should Jasper attempt any further schemes against Georgia. "And take your associates with you when you leave town. Their presence here serves no purpose but intimidation, and that will not be tolerated." Jasper left without further comment, gathering his two companions and departing the bakery with visibly wounded pride, leaving Georgia and Sela's alone in the aftermath of the confrontation. Georgia turned to him immediately, her expression a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Sela's, $300 is an enormous sum. Are you certain you wish to spend your savings this way, on debts that are not truly your responsibility?" "They are my responsibility now," Sela said firmly, pulling her into his arms, feeling the tension gradually ease from her body as she relaxed against his chest. "Anything that threatens you, threatens what we are building together, becomes my responsibility to address, in whatever way I am able. I have spent years accumulating those savings with no particular purpose beyond simple prudence. I can think of no better purpose for that money than securing your safety and your bakery's future. I do not know how to thank you for this," Georgia said, her voice muffled against his chest. "You need not thank me at all," Sela said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Just promise me you will let me help carry these burdens going forward, rather than facing such troubles alone." "That is what partnership means, Georgia, sharing both the joys and the hardships, rather than one person bearing everything while the other stands apart." "I promise," Georgia said, tilting her head back to meet his eyes. "Though I confess, I am not entirely accustomed to having someone to share burdens with. These past months have taught me to expect to face difficulties alone." "Those days are behind you now," Sela said softly. "For as long as you will have me, you will not face anything alone again." True to his word, Sela accompanied Jasper Hale to the bank the following morning, where the documentation proved legitimate, and he paid the full amount from his savings, securing a clear release of the debt with proper legal documentation witnessed by the bank manager himself, ensuring no further disputes could arise regarding the matter. Jasper Hale, his scheme thoroughly foiled and his pride considerably wounded, departed Cedar Falls that same afternoon, and neither Georgia nor Sela ever saw him again, though word reached them some months later through mutual business contacts that he had relocated his cattle trading operations to a territory further west, apparently having decided Colorado no longer suited his interests. With Jasper's threat resolved and his malicious gossip gradually fading as townsfolk witnessed the genuine partnership developing between Georgia and Sela, the couple settled into a period of quiet happiness through the remaining weeks of autumn and into the first snows of winter. Sela continued his work around town while maintaining his growing role at the bakery, and Georgia found herself increasingly dependent on his steady presence, not from weakness, but from the simple joy of shared partnership after months of solitary struggle. As winter deepened, bringing heavy snows that occasionally made travel between the boarding house and the bakery treacherous, Silas raised the question that had been building in his heart for weeks. It was a quiet evening in mid-December, snow falling steadily outside the bakery's windows. The shop closed for the day, and the two of them settled comfortably before the warm glow of the oven, which had continued performing admirably since Silas's initial repairs. "Georgia," he began, taking her hands in his, "I have something I wish to ask you, and I hope you will consider it seriously, knowing the depth of feeling behind the question." Georgia's heart began racing, sensing the significance in his tone and posture. "What is it, Silas?" "I love you more deeply than I ever believed myself capable of loving another person," Silas said, his voice steady despite the evident emotion behind his words. "These past months with you have shown me a kind of happiness and purpose I did not know existed, a partnership that makes both the mountains and this town feel like home, so long as you are present. I do not wish to spend another day without the certainty of our future together. Georgia Maddox, will you marry me?" He produced from his jacket pocket a simple but beautifully crafted ring, its band fashioned from silver he had traded for specifically with this purpose in mind, set with a small piece of turquoise that caught the firelight with warm blue-green brilliance. Georgia felt tears spring to her eyes, joy overwhelming her as she took in the sight of the ring and the sincere devotion in Silas's expression. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Silas, I will marry you. Nothing would make me happier than building a life together with you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and they sealed their engagement with a kiss that carried all the weight of their journey together, from that first smoky morning of burnt bread to this quiet, snow-filled evening of promised commitment. When they finally parted, both were smiling through happy tears, and Georgia held her hand up to admire the ring in the firelight. "It is beautiful, Silas. However did you find time to have this made?" "I have been planning this for some weeks now," Silas admitted with a slightly bashful smile that seemed at odds with his rugged, powerful frame. "Commissioned it from a silversmith over in Fairplay, had it made specifically with you in mind. The turquoise reminded me of the color of your eyes in certain light." "You have thought of everything," Georgia said, touched deeply by the evident care and consideration behind the gesture. They were married in early spring, as the last snows melted from the mountain passes and the first wildflowers began pushing through the thawing earth, in a ceremony held at the small church where Reverend Prout had come to know and respect Silas over the preceding months. The entire town of Cedar Falls turned out for the celebration, the earlier gossip stirred by Jasper Hale long forgotten in the face of the obvious, genuine devotion the couple shared. A devotion that had weathered real tests and proven itself solid and true. Georgia wore a simple but elegant dress of pale blue, her chestnut hair adorned with wildflowers gathered that very morning, and Silas stood at the altar in a new suit that Mrs. Hendricks had helped him select, though he confessed to Georgia later that he had felt considerably more comfortable in his buckskin shirt and trousers, however much the occasion demanded formal attire. Mrs. Prout served as an unofficial matron of honor, having grown close to Georgia over the preceding months, and having become a firm advocate for the relationship after witnessing Jasper Hale's manipulative scheming firsthand. Ezra Coyle, the old trapper who had taught Silas much of what he knew about mountain living, made the journey down from the high country specifically for the occasion, standing as Silas's best man, and offering gruff but heartfelt congratulations to the couple following the ceremony. "Never thought I would see the day this old mountain hermit settled down proper," Ezra said, clapping Silas on the shoulder with obvious affection. "But I reckon if any woman could tame a man like you, it would be one strong enough to run her own bakery through hardship and grief without breaking. You have chosen well, son." "I know it," Silas said, glancing across the reception to where Georgia stood laughing with a group of townswomen, her happiness radiant in the spring sunshine. "Better than I deserve, if I am honest." Following their marriage, the couple faced the practical question of how to structure their future life together, balancing George's commitment to the bakery with Silas's deep connection to his mountain cabin and the trapping livelihood he had built there over the years. After considerable discussion, they arrived at a solution that honored both their needs, purchasing a modest plot of land at the edge of Cedar Falls, close enough to town that Georgia could continue running her bakery with reasonable ease, but with enough surrounding acreage that Silas could maintain a smaller version of the self-sufficient homestead he had grown accustomed to, complete with a garden, a few goats, and easy access to the surrounding hills where he continued modest trapping during the appropriate seasons. Though he scaled back his activities considerably compared to his previous solitary existence. They built their new home together over the following months, Silas applying his considerable skills to construction, while Georgia continued managing the bakery, the two of them finding a rhythm that honored both their individual strengths and their shared commitment to building something lasting together. The bakery itself flourished under their combined efforts, with Silas handling maintenance and even occasionally assisting with early morning preparations before heading out to tend their small homestead, while Georgia's baking reputation continued growing throughout the region, drawing customers from neighboring towns who had heard tell of her exceptional bread and pastries. Their first winter as a married couple brought its own challenges, as heavy snows tested the resilience of their new arrangement, but Silas's years of mountain experience proved invaluable in ensuring their home remained warm and well-provisioned throughout the harshest months, while George's determination and business acumen kept the bakery profitable even during the leaner winter season, when fewer travelers passed through Cedar Falls. It was during their second spring together, as wildflowers once again carpeted the hills surrounding their home, that Georgia discovered she was expecting their first child. She shared the news with Silas one evening as they sat together on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples over the mountains that had first drawn Silas to this region so many years before. "Silas," she said softly, taking his hand and placing it gently against her still flat abdomen, "I have news that I believe will make you very happy." Understanding dawned slowly in his expression, followed by an overwhelming joy that brought unexpected tears to his eyes, a reaction that surprised them both given his generally stoic mountain man demeanor. "Georgia, are you certain? We are truly expecting a child." "I am certain," she confirmed, laughing softly at his evident emotion. "The doctor confirmed it just this morning. Come winter, we shall have a new addition to our family." Silas pulled her into a careful embrace, mindful of her condition despite the pregnancy being in its earliest stages, and pressed a tender kiss to her forehead. "I never imagined such happiness could exist," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "First finding you, then building this life together, and now this. I do not know how I have earned such fortune." "Perhaps some fortunes are simply meant to be," Georgia said, settling comfortably against his broad chest as they continued watching the sunset together. "Perhaps a burnt batch of bread and a stubborn oven were simply the universe's way of bringing us together, setting us on this path that has led to such happiness." Their son, whom they named Thomas Silas Turner in honor of both George's late husband and his own father, was born the following winter, arriving during a snowstorm that tested Silas's mountain skills as he navigated treacherous roads to fetch the town doctor in time for the delivery. The infant arrived healthy and strong, with his mother's hazel eyes, and even at such a young age, hints of his father's solid, sturdy build. Naming their son partially after Thomas had been George's suggestion, offered somewhat hesitantly, uncertain how Silas might feel about honoring her first husband in such a manner. But Silas had embraced the idea wholeheartedly, understanding that Thomas represented an important part of George's history, a part that had shaped who she was when Silas first encountered her, and that acknowledging this history rather than erasing it only strengthened the foundation of their own relationship. Thomas gave you the bakery, gave you the skills and independence that first drew my attention that morning," Silas had said when Georgia proposed the name. "It seems only fitting that our son should carry some acknowledgement of that legacy, alongside the new life we are building together." 2 years later, their family expanded further with the arrival of a daughter, whom they named Ruth after Silas's own mother, who had passed away during the war years before Silas had made his way west. By this time, the bakery had grown considerably from its modest beginnings, with Georgia having trained a young assistant, a local girl named Betsy Coleman, to help manage the increasing demand for her baked goods, allowing Georgia more flexibility to balance her business responsibilities with the demands of raising 2 young children. Silas, meanwhile, had gradually transitioned away from active trapping, finding steady and respected work instead as Cedar Falls' primary carpenter and general handyman. His skills, honed over years of mountain self-sufficiency, proving valuable to a growing town in constant need of construction and repair work. He maintained his connection to the mountains through regular hunting trips and occasional visits to Ezra Coyle, who had grown into something of a beloved family friend, often visiting Cedar Falls to see the children he had come to think of as something like grandchildren, given his own lack of family connections after decades of solitary mountain living. The bakery itself had expanded physically as well, with Silas constructing an addition to accommodate both increased baking capacity and a small seating area where townsfolk could enjoy fresh coffee and pastries, transforming Maddox Bakery, which retained its original name in honor of Georgia's history despite her remarriage, into something of a social hub for Cedar Falls, a place where neighbors gathered to share news and community. Warmed both by the ever-reliable oven and the genuine welcome Georgia and Silas extended to all who entered. Jasper Hale's earlier prediction that the bakery would fail without his investment proved thoroughly and satisfyingly wrong, as the business flourished under Georgia and Silas's combined efforts, becoming not just financially successful but a genuine cornerstone of the growing community, a testament to what determination, honest partnership, and mutual respect could build even from the humblest and most difficult beginnings. As their children grew, both Thomas and Ruth developed early fascinations with their father's mountain heritage, frequently begging for stories of his years living alone in the high country, of the elk herds and mountain lions and harsh winters he had navigated through skill and determination. Silas indulged these requests happily, teaching both children basic wilderness skills as they grew older, ensuring they understood and appreciated the natural world that had shaped so much of his own character and values, even as they grew up in the relative comfort and community of Cedar Falls rather than the isolation he had once called home. Georgia, for her part, found herself increasingly drawn to occasional excursions into the foothills surrounding their home, finally realizing the wish she had expressed so early in their acquaintance, to see the mountains up close that had shaped the man she loved. Silas delighted in showing her his former haunts, the creek where he had fished for trout, the meadow where elk gathered each autumn, even eventually leading her to his original cabin, still standing though somewhat weathered by the years of disuse, a physical reminder of the solitary life he had left behind in favor of the family life they had built together. "Do you ever miss it?" Georgia asked him once, as they stood together outside the old cabin, their children exploring the surrounding woods under the watchful eye of Ezra Coyle, who had accompanied them on this particular expedition. "The solitude, the freedom of living entirely on your own terms up here." Silas considered the question seriously, as he considered most things Georgia asked of him. "I miss certain aspects of it, I suppose. The particular quality of silence you find only in truly remote places, the sense of complete self-reliance that comes from surviving entirely through your own skills and efforts." But he turned to look at her, his expression soft with genuine contentment. What I have found with you, with our children, with the community we have built in Cedar Falls, that fulfills something deeper than the solitude ever did. I thought for years that freedom meant being alone, answerable to no one but myself. I have learned since meeting you that true freedom lies in choosing, again and again, to commit yourself fully to people worth committing to. That is a freedom the mountains alone could never have taught me. Georgia leaned against his solid chest, wrapping her arms around him as much as she could manage given his considerable size. I love you, Silas Turner, more today than even on our wedding day, if such a thing is possible. I believe it entirely possible, Silas said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I find my love for you growing with each passing day, each new memory we build together. I do not believe there is any limit to how much a heart can expand, given sufficient reason and inspiration. They remained in Cedar Falls for the remainder of their lives, watching the small mountain town continue growing and evolving through the following decades, weathering the various changes and challenges that came with the passage of time in the American West, from the eventual arrival of railroad connections that brought new prosperity and new residents, to the gradual taming of the wilder frontier elements that had characterized the region during their earlier years together. Thomas Turner grew to inherit something of both his mother's business acumen and his father's practical skills, eventually taking over management of an expanded Maddox bakery alongside his own wife, while maintaining a workshop where he applied carpentry skills learned from Silas to various community projects. Ruth Turner, meanwhile, developed a passion for medicine after witnessing the town doctor's work during various childhood illnesses and injuries, eventually traveling to Denver for formal medical training before returning to Cedar Falls to establish herself as the region's first female physician, a groundbreaking achievement that both her parents supported wholeheartedly despite the unconventional path it represented for a woman of that era. Georgia and Silas welcomed a third child as well, a son named Ezra after the old trapper who had become such an important figure in their family's life, born several years after Ruth when Georgia had begun to believe her childbearing years were behind her. This late addition to their family brought fresh joy to their household, and young Ezra Turner grew up hearing endless stories from his elderly namesake, before the old trapper finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at the advanced age of 83, having spent his final years as a beloved fixture in the Turner household, treated with all the warmth and respect due a cherished family elder. As they grew older together, Georgia and Silas remained as devoted to one another as they had been in those early days of courtship, their love having weathered and strengthened through decades of shared triumphs and challenges, from the birth and raising of their children to the various economic fluctuations that affected their business, to the natural disasters and hardships that periodically tested any frontier community's resilience. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their now-grown children organized a celebration at the bakery that had started it all, gathering extended family and lifelong friends from throughout Cedar Falls to honor the enduring partnership that had begun with a stranger's chance encounter, with smoke rising from a broken oven on an ordinary autumn morning so many years before. Standing together at this celebration, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, by friends who had witnessed their entire journey together, Silas took Georgia's weathered but still gentle hand in his own, now equally marked by decades of honest work, and spoke words that captured the essence of everything they had built together. 25 years ago, I rode into this town intending only to gather supplies before returning to my solitary mountain existence, he said, his deep voice carrying easily through the gathered crowd, despite the slight roughness age had added to it. Instead, I found a woman whose strength and warmth changed the entire course of my life, who taught me that true fulfillment comes not from isolation but from genuine partnership, from choosing every single day to love and support another person through whatever challenges life presents. Georgia Maddox Turner, You have made every day since that first smoky morning worth living, and I would choose you again in a heartbeat, given the chance to relive our entire story from its very beginning. Georgia, her own hair now streaked with silver, but her eyes still holding the same warmth and determination that had first caught Silas's attention decades before, smiled up at her husband with an expression that spoke volumes about the depth of love that had grown between them across the years. I have never regretted a single moment of our life together, Silas Turner, not the difficult times we weathered nor the countless joys we have shared. You walked into my life at its lowest point, fixed not just my oven but my entire broken heart, and gave me a future I could never have imagined possible in the depths of my earlier grief. I love you today more than I ever thought possible, and I look forward to whatever years we have remaining together, building on the beautiful life we have created. Their story, which had begun with such an ordinary and humble circumstance, a broken oven and a batch of burnt bread on an autumn morning, had grown into something far greater than either of them could have anticipated that first day, a testament to the transformative power of genuine love and partnership, proof that sometimes the most profound relationships emerge from the most unexpected beginnings, and that a broken thing, whether an oven or a grieving heart, could be lovingly repaired and made whole again, given patience, care, and the right person willing to invest the effort required. Silas Turner and Georgia Maddox Turner lived out the remainder of their days in Cedar Falls, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren, their bakery having grown into something of a local institution, their love story becoming something of local legend, told and retold to newcomers, as an example of the genuine possibilities the frontier offered for those brave enough to open their hearts to unexpected connections. Regardless of how different their paths to that connection might initially appear. The mountain man and the widowed baker, brought together by smoke and burnt bread on an ordinary morning, had built together something extraordinary, a love that had weathered grief-scheming rivals, the practical challenges of blending two very different lives, and decades of ordinary daily struggles and joys, emerging through it all not just intact but continually strengthened, a true partnership in every sense of the word. Exactly as Silas had promised on that snowy December evening, when he first asked Georgia to be his wife. Their oven, the very one Silas had repaired that first fateful morning, continued functioning reliably for decades afterward, eventually passed down to their son Thomas when he took over management of the bakery, a physical symbol of the foundation upon which their entire life together had been built, a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness, offered freely to a stranger in need, could set in motion consequences far grander and more beautiful than anyone could initially imagine. And so it was that in the small mountain town of Cedar Falls, Colorado, in the closing decades of the 19th century, a mountain man's chance encounter with a widowed baker's smoking oven grew into a love story that would be remembered for generations, a testament to the enduring power of genuine connection found in the most unexpected of circumstances, proof that even in the harsh and often unforgiving landscape of the American frontier, tenderness, partnership, and true love could take root and flourish, given the right conditions and the courage of two hearts willing to risk vulnerability in pursuit of shared happiness.